subthalamic nucleus, go through the substantia nigra recta, thalamus, and back to the cortex. So always have the back of mind that the indirect route is just a stepping down pathway. The direct route just gives you a straight function, motor movement. And so we have these two parts to look at. So depending on which one tends to potentiate more, then you have a difference in what is going to happen. Here we have the substantia nigra, very particular here. All the ones in green from the cortex, either cortex, straight to the putamen or the corpus caudate nucleus. These are all excitatory pathway. Now, the substantia nigra plays a modulatory role on the corpus striatum. But we also have the inhibitory pathway from the corpus striatum. If it goes directly to the internal part of the globus pallidus or the substantia reticulatum, or it goes to the external part of the globus pallidus onto the subthalamic nucleus to the globus pallidus internal or substantia nigra, they will again produce an inhibition on the thalamus, ventral anterior, ventrolateral nucleus, and meanwhile there is still a excitatory pathway here. But dopamine will always modulate at this level, to make sure that there is a balance such that whatever movement is to be executed depending on the planned movement. Remember, we're talking of learned movement. So you decided to execute a line of movement. Now, what the corpus striatum is going to do is to work with you based on your decision to undertake that movement. If you want it as a fast movement, you want it as a slow movement, or you want it to go at what we consider normal. I showed you a walking pattern. Nobody taught you that. That's your normal way of walking, And that's how the brain was wired to develop. So with that, if you now look at the direct pathway, or what happens is from the cortex, glutamate activates this pathway to the striatum, and the next thing is there's an increased GABA which inhibits the neuron in the internal part of the globus pallidus and substantia reticulatum, and from there we have a decreased GABA. The decreased GABA will increase the activity which will disinhibit the neurons in the thalamus, and from that point we have an excitation because there's an increased glutamate which increases activity of this supplementary motor area, and at the end of this circuit a movement is promoted. So this is a direct pathway that we have. If you look at the indirect pathway, this is what happens. This is where the difference comes. So again, we have the excitation activates this striatum, the medial spinal neurons, projection neurons. They will activate this, and we have an increased GABA which inhibits the neurons in the external part of the globus pallidus, and that leads to decreased GABA. This will disinhibit the nucleus of the subthalamic nucleus, and then we have increased glutamate activates the internal part of globus pallidus and the substantia nigra neurons, and that is followed with an increased GABA which inhibits the thalamic nucleus, ventral anterior and ventrolateral neurons, and then there's a decreased glutamate, decreases activity of the supplementary motor area. Then we have an inhibition of the movement. So remember, these activities take place continuously as long as there's a movement that is being planned. And so dopamine will influence either the direct or indirect pathway. We try to produce that modulation that you need to have a balance in the movements that are taking place. Now, in addition to dopamine playing that role, in the striatum we have the striatal cholinergic fibers or neurons that produce acetylcholine. And so the striatal cholinergic neurons will again come in at this point to be associated with the D2 and the indirect part of the movements that we are referring to. However, there is also the hyper movement, and the hyper is associated with the direct pathway. And what happens is that the subthalamic nucleus will exert a powerful excitation onto the adult nuclei. They will bypass, if you remember when I talked of the modern organization, they will bypass the input nuclei. But here we have a shorter, conduction time, the green path. So it exacts on this, a shorter time, which will exact its influence on this, and straight on it will convey its effect straight back to the cortex. This is a hyper direct movement. And I gave you two extremes. I gave you a catwalk, which is a slow movement, and I gave you the gymnastics, the movement that takes place. So we're looking at a hyper direct movement now associated with the basal ganglia. Now, what will be the normal function? Once the circuitry is complete, remember it starts from the cortex, returns to the cortex. It's after that sequencing and storage of that movement happens. Then we now have a connection from the motor cortex with the pyramidal pathway. And it's that connection that will now produce that movement that you and I will see in the periphery. And that is where the connection between the extrapyramidal, after the circuitry, comes into the motor cortex, that, or supplementary motor cortex, that the corticospinal tract takes out of the cerebral cortex to produce the movement you see. And so if there's a disorder, you can see the peripheral tremor, you can see that at the extremes. You're not seeing it in the brain, but then the effect you're seeing is having passed through that point to now show in the periphery. Now also remember that this pathway, the corticospinal pathway, also carries what we call the corticonuclear or corticobulbar. Corticobulbar is used older terminology based on the shape of the brainstem, but the more nomenclature that helps you to connect with this function is the corticonuclear. And those ones are simply from this, they are part of the corticospinal tract, but as they get to the brainstem, they exit and end on the motor nuclei of cranial nerves. So the cranial nerve with motor nuclei will receive fibers from the corticospinal tract called the corticonuclear fibers, and that is how those effects too are carried through the motor nuclei of the cranial nerves. So that is the motor lobe. Now remember, at the same time that we have this motor lobe taking place, we also have the cognitive lobe. And I'm not going to go into the details of, but each of these, has a process. For example, the cognitive lobe is what we refer to, would pass through the prefrontal cortex. Now, the prefrontal cortex, it will go to the anterior cortex, and then, of course, the globus pallidus, substantia nigra, reticulata, middodorsal and ventral anterior nucleus, and back to the cortex. That is the cognitive lobe. Then the limbic lobe, again, anterior cingulate orbitofrontal cortex, through the amygdala, the hippocampus, the temporal cortex, where the ventral striatum, ventral pallidum, middodorsal nucleus, back to the cingulate cortex. Then the oculomotor lobe, the frontal eye field. Remember, I just told you corticonuclear fibers. The oculomotor lobe, posterior parietal frontal cortex, the caudate nucleus, the globus pallidus, internal segment, then the middodorsal, and back to the cortex. If you look across, you can pick out the different nuclear groups that is associated with each of these lobes. The first one is prefrontal cortex. Here is the amygdala, which brings it into the limbic system, and here is the posterior parietal cortex. Then the next is the anterior caudate for the cognitive pathway, ventral striatum for the limbic, and caudate for the oculomotor lobe. At this level of interaction of projection neurons, the the prefrontal lobe and the oculomotor lobe have similarities in terms of where that projection neurons will end. And of course, at the thalamic point, mediodorsal cuts across. So it's not as if one takes place and completes its process before the other. They all four go together. And the brain responds to that. Either it creates the memory for it, or puts a behavior, emotional aspect to it, or uses a direct effect for response to it, or it refocuses the movement. So these four circuits will always operate at the same time. Then, between the direct and indirect, what happens? While they will balance the movements that are taking place, they will balance the regulation of the movement as depending on what decision you make or which movement you want to undertake. Now, if for any reason there is an imbalance of movement in favor of the direct pathway, then it means we're going to have a hyperkinetic disorder. And that means you will see things like dyskinesia, tremor, dystonia, atitosis, chorea, balismus, and tics. So you have a hyper. In this case, there is a hyperkinetic disorder potentiating the hyperdirect disorder. Now, if on the other hand we have imbalance in favor of indirect pathway, then you have a hypokinetic. Remember, the indirect is supposed to slow down. Now it slows down and really slows down the movement that you expect. So you have a hypokinesia, you have bradykinesia, and you have akinesia. But if you now look at the disorders that have been associated with the basal ganglia, this is our normal process. So we have the cortex, you have this way, literally, the cortical spinal tract goes on past the spinal cord, goes to the periphery. However, we now have our basal ganglia component here, the extrapyramidal pathway. The pyramid is there, D1, D2. We have our substantia nigra compacta, globus pallidus externa, and on to globus pallidus interna for the indirect pathway, and thalamus, and back to the cortex. But in Parkinson's disease, this is what you find, is that the depletion of dopamine, and this is secondary to the loss of the neurons in the substantia nigra compacta. That will produce the hypokinesis that you observe, and of course the slowness of the voluntary movement, increased muscle tone in this case. So here, this is where we expect that the substantia nigra compacta will produce the dopamine that we need, but that is not happening. Then, in terms of hemibalismus, you expect this ballistic kind of movement taking place in this case, undesired movement, uncontrolled. And what is happening in that case is that the subthalamic nucleus is where the problem is. And so all other parts are fine, but here is where the issue is. The subthalamic nucleus is not doing what it's supposed to do in this case. Then, of course, if you look at chorea, decreased activity of striatal D2 receptors. There's a jerky, brief, semi-directed regular movements that are not repetitive or rhythmic, as it will repeat the movement, it can't repeat the movement as it's supposed to be, explanation, pronation kind of movement can't. So what is happening here is that we have the D2 specific receptors on this area being inhibited such that this part is depleting and you have a chorea taking place. So if you look at the substantia nigra itself, like we said, that was nigra just associated the fact that we have neuromelanin that gives it this dark pigmentation that you observe. And it's usually coming more from the substantia nigra compacta, that is where these neurons are mostly placed. But of course, they may contain dopamine in other species without necessarily giving this dark pigmentation. Now what happens is, this is a normal substantia nigra. You can see the dark pigmentation. I mean, this is visible to the naked eye. If you make it, you could do a section of the brainstem at the level of the superior colliculus, where you find the red nucleus, which is usually the landmark you see. You will see the dark pigmented area of the substantia nigra, which is what you see here. But interestingly, in Parkinson's disease, we can see the depletion of the dopaminergic neurons in the substantia nigra. The same thing, this is a normal, and this is the Parkinson's disease substantia nigra zone. So there's the loss of dopaminergic neurons in this case, and that is what is responsible. So for the Parkinson's disease you observe. So here is just again, just to put it together. We have the dopamine depletion, and that dopamine depletion is what will lead to disinhibition of D2 receptor bearing striatal neurons in the indirect pathway. And again, there's an increased inhibition of the external part of the globus pallidus, and that would disinhibit the subthalamic nucleus and lead to an overactivity of the subthalamic nucleus, and then you have an excess excitation in basal ganglia output. And so we have over-inhibition of the thalamocortical part and the brain stem motor centers. Then in this kinesia, this is characterized by the fact that we have a reduced activity, again, in the subthalamic nucleus, and that will lead to a DA-induced over-inhibition of the striatal globus pallidus external neurons with excess inhibition of the subthalamic nucleus. It will reduce the activation of the basal ganglia output. And then at the end, you have a reduced inhibition of thalamocortical neurons and excess drive of cortical motor areas resulting in dyskinesia. So what you find is the indirect route becomes inhibitory, the direct route is more of excitatory. And it's that balance that you have that will produce what you consider first as a normal movement based on the basal ganglia before you can now think of the disorders that is associated, including Parkinson's disease. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Amadi, for that stimulating talk. Any reactions?
I didn't have time. You can also normally, if you have more time, you can pull out even the brief cognitive part, of the movement, the loop, and you pull out the limbic part of the loop, and you pull the frontal eye field, and that's when you actually appreciate how the complex movements that are taking place. And then when you have a disorder, you can now you must relate the 4 circuits, even in Parkinson's disease. You don't just look at just the motor loop disorder, or you must always relate, again, with that cognitive part of movement. You need to literally teach the person to move or not to. You need to, because I'm sure you saw the last talk when he said trying to do that, to complete that. You need to know that she needs to create a new memory of the movement to take, and you need to know that the eye plays a very important role in the whole circuits that we have in the brain.
Thank you, Prof, for that very good presentation and a lot of learning, because I'm not a neurobiologist. I'm just wondering, for professional catwalk, professional gymnastics, where they spend almost every living minute of their lives on land moving, does that result in any imbalance? Like now they lose sight, the brain loses down the normal. Because you see people now, they learn to walk in a different path altogether. Do they lose, or is there degeneration in the normal? And they go back to the normal to spend so much of their life on land movement?
Yes, the answer is yes, they will go back to normal. And that is where neuroplasticity comes in. Because now the brain is being told, if you, sometimes we say follow the lifestyle of the person. Every day he's in the gym practicing. He starts withdrawing that. and the brain responds. And that is one of the things when we're talking about these stressors of the brain. The brain will always respond, no matter the age, to whatever is continuously exposed to the brain. So when you withdraw those daily activities that puts you at that hyperkinetic, that's the word I'll use, hyperkinetic mode, the brain responds to you as long as you go on the hyperkinetic mode. If you choose to now start withdrawing, the brain will start, but it doesn't happen overnight. You must also allow the brain to go through the neuroplasticity that it needs to start cutting down on that activity, and it comes back to what you are the one deciding. You decide, is my lifestyle now, it responds to that. It's not as if there's a degeneration of any kind, no. But it's just that the brain is readjusting. You know. The other word we normally use, we talk of long-term potentiation. You know, that continuous stimulus keeps allowing the brain to respond to you. And that is one thing with circuits. At any of those points, you decide to continuously expose the brain to a stimulation and to respond. When you decide again to withdraw, the brain will start withdrawing. But there's no degeneration in that case.
Okay, thank you. Obaka from Malaysia. Yeah, you spoke on Princeton, which I also have to teach my students, but I probably only have 5 minutes to cover everything, but very well done. Just that you mentioned a bit on the ballistic movement, right? Normally seen in Huntington's disease. So is there an overlap here between Parkinson's ballistic movement and Huntington's?
Yes. The first answer, there is an overlap in that case. That would be your first answer. It's just down to, I didn't talk of the Lewy bodies, which I had a focus on it. There's a magnified Lewy body in that substantial area where I showed the normal and the Parkinson's disease brain. Okay, the Lewy body starts also showing at a particular stage when you do an immunostaining of that area. Yes, there is.
Okay, thank you, Prof. My own is not a question, but to first of all say thank you, because the first time I met you was in 2012 in Ibadan, Nigeria. So you were invited to give a talk on neuroplasticity, and that's actually developed my interest in Parkinson's disease. Going forward to do my PhD at Stellenbosch University, South Africa, and then to be a postdoc for 3 years at UCT. And I've been tracking the record. In fact, I wanted to attend your inaugural, but I must say that what you have added again to this talk is the aspect of cognition, the memory in Parkinson's disease, and how they are connected. And I would love to learn more about that. Thank you very
Let's have Prof is around the whole time, so we will have an opportunity to interact with him a bit more. So, Prof, the saddle to then moderate.
Yes.
From now on.
Biomarkers.
Yes.
Is it here or is it online? Oh, okay. Biomarkers.
Okay, very good afternoon. Thank you so much, Dr. Ahmad. To Dr. Chilani, thank you for the invite. To I also, members from IPR and also participants of this Hebrew workshop. I've been tasked to discuss biomarkers in Parkinson's disease. I come from Malaysia, University Technology Mara, and just to declare no conflict of interest of any of the drugs that I will mention. So just to recap, this is Malaysia, where Malaysia is, and this is where we are almost along the same latitude. Malaysia is a country divided by the South China Sea with the peninsula or the West Malaysia and also the other side, which is in the Borneo Island. We call it the East Malaysia. Population of about 30 million, independent about the time of Kenyan independence. Ours was 1957. Just to introduce biomarkers in terms of definition by National NIH Biomarkers Definition Working Group, a measurable indicator of some biological state or condition that is objectively measured and evaluated to examine normal biological processes, pathogenic processes, or pharmacologic responses to a therapeutic intervention. This is one definition, but another definition is, again, measurable substance in an organism whose presence is indicative of some phenomena such as disease, infection, or environmental exposure. But in this definition, what is important is this phrase, druggable targets. Basically, the idea of identifying a biomarker, hopefully, with the intention to hit the biomarker for treatment purposes, if possible. So under FDA, they have this biomarker qualification program, which is an extensive description of how substance is considered to be a biomarker. And mostly the definition relates to the druggable or biomarker that can be a druggable target. I'm not going to that, but basically, based on function, biomarkers can be classified, among others, into these three major, and there can be a few more. Basically, they are known as susceptibility risk biomarkers, which represent the potential for developing Parkinson's disease. It can be diagnostic biomarkers used to confirm the presence of PD, and also prognostic or probably predictive biomarkers indicating disease progression, treatment-associated changes, or disease recurrence. And biomarkers may include physiological measurements or bodily fluid or tissue examinations. It can also be genetic or metabolic data. Imaging measures, quite prominent and familiar, and can even be rating scales or the survey measures. Just thinking about gut microbiota probably can also be considered as biomarkers nowadays. So I just want to briefly mention what we are doing in Malaysia before we go into PD. We are more into AD, but just going into PD recently. But our work on blood-based biomarkers started about 5 years ago, and with the grant that we received from the government of Malaysia, we tried to identify certain biomarkers which are maybe special to population of Malaysia, maybe different from population of other countries. So we know in terms of AD, the preclinical state, then followed by many years after that, with the first symptoms, some probably be in the form of specific memory disorder, and then moving progressively and it's a relentlessly, irreversibly into dementia. So basically, early diagnosis definitely would facilitate effective use of disease modifiers. So in principle, it may be possible to advance the diagnosis much earlier by improving the predictive validity of the prodromal risk factors based upon cognitive decline and subjective impairment. One widely advocated approach is the incorporation of disease biomarkers that may indirectly represent the extent of underlying neuropathology. So we started with the problem statement in the sense that, of course, there can be many ways of trying to look out for biomarkers or detection method of AD. But overall, the problem, for example, normally using neuropsychological assessment. This would be identifying 80 patients in advanced stage, at the advanced stage, and they are defined also by signs and symptoms. So the other thing is that, of course, with regard to AD, the definite diagnosis is post-mortem neuropathological examination. So these are limitations in terms of using the neuropsychological assessment. Next, for CSF measurement, also considered to be quite a barrier because of the invasiveness of the procedure, also requiring highly trained personnel, and in some countries this is not accepted quite willingly by some patients. And for neuroimaging, obviously, in Malaysia, country like Malaysia, it's not easily available for diagnostic. Not easily available for diagnostic, also for research because of the cost. So all this made us try to so we want to look out for less invasive method, of course, more reliable, simple, sensitive biomarkers. So our aim was to find a blood-based biomarker, which I'm sure is easier to obtain from patients, and also if we can use the tools that we have, which is of less cost, then that would be more desirable. Studies have shown that peripheral blood cells are sensitive to changes in the CNS and share gene expression patterns in the blood. So basically, central dogma of system biology, as mentioned, discussed many times in the last 2 days, we have from DNA to RNA, protein metabolites, and on this side we have the genomics, the omics, or transcriptomics, proteomics, or metabolomics. And this represents, for example, the genomics, the gene study of what could happen, transcriptomics, what might happen, proteomics is what's happening, and metabolomics basically looking at what has happened. So we try to use some of this omics technique for early detection, and we use our Malaysian subjects. Malaysia is quite diverse in terms of ethnic variation. We have people from China, from India, the local Malaysians, and because of that, our subject, of course, has to include all these ethnic groups. So when these are all with permission. And just to jump straight away to results of our studies, we identified 6 genes. I think this seems to be quite novel for Malaysia. But of course, that study involved only about 180 and 100 non-AD patients, so number is not that big. We have to gather more subjects. But later on, using lots of bioinformatics, we were able also to look at the metabolites and also the cytokines for us to also identify several potential biomarkers from these groups of substances. So currently, we have moved a bit upstream earlier to see whether we can find similar biomarkers during this stage called cognitive frailty, meaning a stage before the MCI, mild cognitive impairment, and also dementia. We have, for this study, we're also looking at fecal samples of patients or subjects and trying to relate that to the microbiomes. For this study, it seems that we are able to gather more subjects quite easily, because the last time we organized walk-in, we managed to get over 1,000 people interested to come in to donate the blood samples and also fecal samples. So I think this particular work will be a bit better to defend in terms of robustness and validity. So biomarkers of Parkinson's disease, I think just kind of a very rough journey into what is available now. So in PD, as we discussed the last 2 days, there is a long latency between the first damage to cells in at-risk nuclei of the CNS and the onset of clinical symptoms. And again, we know that the PD signs and symptoms normally do not develop until about 70 to 80% of the GA neurons has been damaged. And that allows a window of opportunity basically. If we could identify the biomarkers for us to intervene earlier. And I think this has been the main theme of our workshop, trying to find ways to identify earlier and try to intervene faster. So identifying patients in the period between the presumed onset of dopaminergic cell loss and the appearance of clinical Parkinsonism may be of major importance for the development of effective neuroprotective treatment strategies. Just looking at the Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease connection, what has been said is that, of course, sometimes, even though this morning we heard about the monoclonal antibody also used for potential treatment of PD, but previously when AD, in terms of drug discovery effort, because the identification of biomarkers was quite clear in the sense that Alzheimer's disease neuroimaging initiative mentioned or translated both the biochemical markers, the form of CSF, we know, myeloid beta and also tau, and imaging biomarkers. So because of the availability of these so-called endpoints, it was probably more guided in terms of those working on drug discovery to move, because they try to find something to be able to hit on the endpoints. And these endpoints, as we know, are the beta amyloid and also the tau, and supported by ligands specific amyloid beta deposition. So, since they know the target, so the invention of drugs towards those targets may be a bit more, like I said, guided. Unlike Parkinson's disease, until recently, because of the inavailability of those targets, meaning the invention or introduction of new drugs would be a bit more difficult. But this morning we heard about the MABs introduced for Parkinson's. Again, both have not been considered as successful for reasons that I think they are based only on those questionnaires in terms of looking at the endpoint. Whether they affect the endpoints or not based on the actual proteins. Remember, recently there was a report regarding lecanemab, which is a monoclonal antibody approved for registration by FDA under the fast track registration. Yes, this morning, Dr. Hooker mentioned that the response or the result was not that good because there was a reduction only of about 27% in terms of improving the symptoms. But it has been said that lecanemab can act specifically and selectively against the beta amyloid protein, and previously many other MABs were rejected because of their side effects and low specificity. A strong point about lecanemab is that it has the ability to attack the beta amyloid before they become clumps, and that is where the previously introduced drug aducanumab seemed to be a bit more difficult to get the buy-in because its action is not as early as lecanemab. Because it seems that lecanemab can also work on protofibrils, and these are the prior to becoming so-called clumps or proteins, bad proteins. And also, since that lecanemab improves or at least avoid the blocking of synaptic calcium ion activity. So PD biomarkers, the four main types, and there can be a few more, of course. The clinical signs, symptoms, imaging techniques that can be used, or we can measure the level of biochemicals in the blood, CSF, and so on. And also, we can also do genetic screening to find the biomarkers. And for a long time, also dopamine metabolites, amino acids, and also in the bloodstream, cerebrospinal fluid was also considered to be most promising. This is a summary of biomarkers of PD at various stages. This is from Kaka in Mumbai. Those at the prodromal PD stage, preclinical and also clinical PD. So prodromal, for example, the non-motor symptoms are considered to be biomarkers, depression, anxiety, and sleep disorder. At the preclinical, we have, for example, imaging that can be done, and also biochemical markers are here. And at clinical, of course, all the symptoms that we discussed so often yesterday. So looking at the biochemical biomarkers, these are the usual suspects, I would say. Many of you are experts and you know very well some of these biomarkers. For example, the alpha-synuclein, the various forms, the soluble, the aggregated, and the PTM version considered to be probably most efficient. And there may also be some microRNA-based analysis that may offer alternative. And mostly the discussion is that there can never be one single biomarker that could explain or describe PD. It's going to be a combination of several. I think it's quite true. So combination is the more likely scenario. But another promising would be analysis of advanced omics, as mentioned earlier, and including also cytogenomics and metabolomics. But recent paper on the opportunities and challenges of alpha-synuclein as potential biomarker for PD and other synuclein no pathways. This came out just a few weeks ago, or in July 22, sorry. And summary of that says that we propose a combined biomarker approach based on integrating biochemical, aggregation, and structure features of alpha-syn in addition to other biomarkers of neurodegeneration. So again, combination seems to be the way forward. Of course, the other, like orexin, for example, known to be maybe to have a role in PD, for example, especially with patients falling asleep, narcoleptic experience during the day that may show the involvement of orexin in terms of PD. So astrocytes may be involved in the progression of PD because of production of pro-inflammatory cytokines that damage dopaminergic neurons. Concentration of orexin A is lower in PD than in healthy individuals, and this also seems to point to the level of orexin being related to severity of the disease. Then we have the other biochemical biomarker, 8-hydroxy-2-deoxyguanosine. Again, increase in this level compared to normal individuals, and the finding was that the difference not as significant as in the serum level, meaning more significant in the CSF. However, 8-hydroxy-deoxyguanosine is a marker of oxidative DNA damage, so may not be so specific for PD alone. Then we also have the peripheral proteasomes and caspase activity, caspase-3, for example, known to be increased in advanced PD, and since the initiation of apoptosis, this may be related to also PD in some ways. Then we have the dopamine receptor and transporter activity. So these are many other neurochemical biochemicals that are thought to be maybe relevant in the study of biomarkers for PD. The metabolites of dopamine and so on. And the understanding of the involvement of these metabolites may be, for example, seem to be promising because there is an effect on the locus coeruleus, and this happens much earlier than the consequence of the alpha-synuclein activity throughout the brainstem onwards. I think Dr. Ahmad discussed locus coeruleus just now. Okay. It's a very small nucleus, but very important nucleus. The latest report from Kobe University and Hiroshima University regarding new biomarker that may enable rapid inexpensive diagnosis of PD. This is under the P450 or CYP groups of enzyme. What they have developed, they call P450 inhibition assay. And it seems that if they can do this also in PD samples, blood samples from Parkinson's disease patient, this can also reflect the condition of the patient. So this is rather new, importantly, recently. And yesterday was very interesting from Newcastle. We heard of the possibility of skin swab for detection of PD, and also most interestingly, the ability of an individual to do sniffing and to identify whether there is a potential for somebody to develop PD or already experiencing PD symptoms. It is probably in the form of, in terms of development of medical device, it can be in the form of ENOS. So I guess, yeah, these are the challenges in terms of trying to locate biomarkers in PD, as also in other diseases, of course, the standardization of that particular biomarkers, and the types of biomarkers and patients. Sometimes biomarkers sometimes is relevant to one section of the community, but not in other communities. And then, so we need to study the right patient population. And most importantly, the large-scale discovery effort is pertinent in trying to, again, validate the robustness of our biomarker. And most likely in the future or in the coming years, it has to be a combination of biomarkers. There's also a comment saying that sometimes we focus on markers that try to discriminate PD from controls and other diseases. Why not consider markers that separate subgroups within PD? So also, in terms of biomarkers, we have to insist on replication and confirmation. So I guess that's the quick roundup of biomarkers, a bit in Alzheimer's disease and also in Parkinson's disease. Thank you very much.
Anybody with questions? I put this, the e-sniffing, the e-note sniffing. The story of one lady recently on that.
Yeah.
giant rat which has the ability to sling landmines.
Will use my computer because I have some videos. Okay, I am the next speaker.
Any
I have an adapter. If you, how do you know the next?
I'm trying to check for the people will be online.
which can sneak
We have a few people online who still want to follow up on the presentation.
Ah, yeah, but the videos are very big in size. I cannot.
I was talking of the African giant mat, which has
Okay.
the olfactory bulb has additional
You have an
layers,
adapter?
and the level of cell proliferation in the olfactory bulb is very high. The migratory process from the lateral ventricle to the olfactory bulb is also rapid. So the no sniffing is is quite interesting. Yeah. Okay. So we'll move on. Thanks, everyone.
Use my computer.
Okay, so
The problem is the connection with people. They will not see my presentation.
copy for drive your presentation. Was a copy for drive.
What's the sign? Also the help. Like this? What do you mean? The problem is not the presentation, the videos that they are linked to the presentation. We can connect directly.